The rain hadn't stopped in days. The Bronx streets shimmered beneath the gaslight, slick with oil and shadows. It was 1902, and in a narrow tenement on East 169th Street, the cries of a newborn echoed against the thin walls. His mother called him Arthur Flagenheimer, a name that, at that moment, meant nothing to anyone but her. No one could have known that this fragile child, born to poor German Jewish immigrants, would one day become one of the most feared names in the criminal underworld of New York. The baby's father, Herman, was a quiet man, a tailor who stitched coats for pennies. His mother, Emma, was tough, proud, and unyielding, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table. They were immigrants chasing the American dream, only to find that in the Bronx, the dream was a cruel joke. Poverty wasn't a visitor there. It was the landlord. Arthur grew up surrounded by noise, arguments in Yiddish, the cry of babies, the hiss of steam radiators, and the constant thud of footsteps from neighbors who were always one eviction notice away from the streets. The boy learned early that kindness didn't fill bellies. By the time he was 8, his father had vanished, one day simply gone, leaving Emma to raise him and his sister alone. Some said Herman ran away with another woman. Others whispered he'd just given up, walked out into the city, and never came back. For Arthur, it didn't matter. His father's absence became the wound that would never heal, a quiet fury that grew stronger with every year. He spent his boyhood running errands for shopkeepers and stealing coal from freight trains. The older boys taught him how to throw punches and when to run. He learned that respect wasn't given. It was taken, often with blood. School was a waste of time in his mind. Books didn't feed you. Street smarts did. By 14, Arthur was already working in a factory, shoveling sweat and anger into long hours. But no matter how much he worked, the pay never caught up with the hunger. At night, he watched the men who didn't go to bed hungry, the gamblers, the bootleggers, the street hustlers who strutted through the neighborhood in sharp suits and slick hair. They weren't educated or refined, but they had something he craved: control. They didn't answer to anyone. They made their own rules. Arthur studied them, memorized how they talked, how they walked, how they looked people in the eye like they owned the world. He didn't know it yet, but he was already rehearsing for the role he would one day play. The first time Arthur got arrested, he was 17. Petty larceny, they called it. He'd stolen a few dollars from the cash register of a warehouse where he worked. He didn't deny it. He just stared at the arresting officer, cold and defiant. When the judge gave him time on Blackwell's Island, Arthur didn't cry like the others. He gritted his teeth and learned. Prison was an education. He saw what power looked like up close, how the guards feared the men who could bribe them, how prisoners respected the ones who could get things done. By the time he walked out, Arthur Flagenheimer was gone. He needed a name that commanded respect, one that didn't sound like the poor immigrant boy who used to beg for coal. So he gave himself a new one, Dutch Schultz. No one knows exactly where the name came from. Some say it was a nod to an old Bronx gangster. Others say it was just the kind of name that made people stop and listen. Whatever the truth, it fit him like a tailored suit. Dutch Schultz, it sounded hard, unbreakable, dangerous. And that was exactly what he wanted to be. The early 1920s were a new age of sin. The government had done something remarkable. It had made alcohol illegal. And with one stroke of a pen, they turned men like Dutch into businessmen. Prohibition was supposed to save America's soul, but it only made devils rich. In the back rooms of saloons and barbershops, deals were made over whiskey and blood. Dutch saw it coming before most did. He started as an enforcer for a Bronx speakeasy, collecting debts and breaking skulls for men who were too soft to get their hands dirty. His fists were his credentials, and soon everyone knew better than to cross him. But Dutch wasn't content with being muscle. He had a head for numbers, for logistics. He noticed which bars sold the most booze, which cops could be bought, which trucks got stopped, and which didn't. He began organizing deliveries himself, taking a cut from every keg that crossed his path. The money rolled in faster than he could count it, and with each dollar, his confidence grew. By his mid-20s, he was running one of the most efficient bootlegging operations in the Bronx. The nights belonged to him. Trucks roared down back streets filled with contraband beer, warehouses overflowed with barrels, and every bar in the Bronx seemed to owe him something. Dutch's men, tough, loyal, and well-armed, patrolled his empire like soldiers guarding a kingdom. He demanded loyalty and returned it with protection. If you were with Dutch, you were safe. If you weren't, you'd better pray. He became a local legend. People whispered his name with a mixture of admiration and fear. He had that rare quality that made people follow him even when they knew it could kill them. Maybe it was his cold eyes, or the way he smiled when he was about to do something terrible. He wasn't tall, but he had presence, a quiet menace that filled the room before he even spoke. The money brought women, cars, and luxury, but also a new kind of trouble. Rival gangs wanted what he had. The Irish mobs tried to muscle in on his beer roots, and Dutch responded the only way he knew how, with bullets. The newspapers called it the Bronx Beer Wars, a series of brutal shootouts that left bodies in alleys and headlines splattered with blood. But behind the violence was order. Dutch was a businessman in his own twisted way. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed for efficiency. Every corpse was a message, every explosion a warning. Stay out of my territory. Still, beneath the violence, Dutch believed in something like loyalty. He paid his men well, made sure their families were fed, and expected absolute obedience in return. Betrayal was the only sin he couldn't forgive. When a driver once skimmed money from a delivery, Dutch didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked at the man, sighed, and then had him shot in the leg in front of the others. "Let this be a lesson," he said, calm as ice. "You steal from me once, you don't get a second chance." The Bronx became his fortress. Politicians drank his beer, cops took his envelopes, and even judges turned a blind eye. Dutch Schultz was no longer a criminal. He was an institution. His name opened doors and closed mouths. For a boy who grew up hungry, it was intoxicating. He'd beaten the world that once spat on him. He'd turned poverty into an empire. But behind the power, the same old rage still burned. The ghost of his father's abandonment never left him. It whispered in the back of his mind, telling him it could all disappear just as quickly as it came. One winter night, as snow fell on the city, Dutch stood on the roof of one of his warehouses, looking out at the lights of New York. Below him, his men were loading trucks with illegal beer. Each one represented money, power, survival. He took a deep breath of the cold air and smiled faintly. Everything he had, he'd built from nothing. Every dollar was carved from the bones of the city. Yet even as he smiled, he couldn't shake the feeling that the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. The world around him was changing. The Italians were organizing. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, names whispered in the dark. They weren't just gangsters. They were visionaries building something bigger, something structured. Dutch admired their brains but despised their calm. He wasn't built for quiet power. He was a storm, not a strategist. He still preferred to handle problems the old way, with fists and fear. That style made him feared, but it also made him enemies. The Irish wanted revenge for the beer wars, the Italians wanted his roots, and even the cops he once owned were starting to shift their loyalty elsewhere. Dutch didn't care. He'd built his empire with his own hands, and he'd die before giving it up. But for now, his empire was untouchable. His trucks kept rolling, his breweries kept boiling, and his pockets stayed full. At night, he'd sit in the back of a smoky speakeasy, his hat tilted low, a cigar between his fingers, the city's pulse beating to his rhythm. He was a king in all but name, a king of beer, bullets, and fear. Yet somewhere deep down, the same thought haunted him. He'd seen too many kings fall, too many empires rot from within. He knew it was only a matter of time before the wolves came for him, too. He didn't know who they'd be, cops, rivals, or even his own men, but he could feel it in his bones. Power, after all, was the most dangerous drug of all, and Dutch Schultz was already addicted beyond saving. Still, he wouldn't trade it for anything. Not the money, not the blood, not the danger. He had risen from nothing to rule one of the most profitable empires in the underworld. And though the city's night air whispered warnings he refused to hear, Dutch Schultz kept walking deeper into the shadows, certain that the darkness belonged to him. As the music of the speakeasies roared and the city's heartbeat pulsed through its alleys, Dutch sat in his corner booth, glass in hand, the noise around him fading to a low hum. He didn't know it then, but the empire he had fought so hard to build was already cracking at the edges. The same violence that had built his throne would one day tear it apart. But for now, he was untouchable. The beer baron of New York, the king of the Bronx, the man who turned prohibition into profit. The boy who had once been Arthur Flegenheimer had vanished into history's smoke. Only Dutch Schultz remained, a name that would soon be written in both glory and blood. The smell of beer and gasoline clung to the Bronx like fog. In those days, the city never really slept. It just changed its rhythm after dark. In the daylight, you'd hear the trolleys and the chatter of housewives. But once the sun went down, the heartbeat of the streets belonged to men like Dutch Schultz. His trucks moved like phantoms through the alleys, loaded with illegal liquor brewed in hidden warehouses, guarded by men who'd kill without hesitation. Every night was a game of survival, police raids, rival gangs, double crosses. But Dutch thrived in the chaos. To him, it wasn't just business. It was war, and war was the one thing he truly understood. He had transformed his operations into a machine, tight, efficient, and ruthless. His drivers ran on schedules that rivaled the city's own subway system. His breweries disguised as laundromats, bakeries, even funeral homes. The money flowed faster than he could spend it. But Dutch wasn't the type to count dollars for the sake of counting. He wanted to own the Bronx. Every block, every bar, every man who dared pour a drink owed something to him. And if they didn't, they'd learn the hard way. Dutch's closest men were more like lieutenants than friends. Otto Abadaba Berman was his accountant, a quiet genius with the soul of a gambler. Where Dutch saw chaos, Otto saw patterns, numbers, ledgers, odds. He was the one who kept the empire's books from collapsing under the weight of its own greed. Then there was Bo Weinberg, his right-hand man, sharp and deadly loyal, or so Dutch thought. Together they were an unstoppable trio, running the Bronx like a kingdom and treating every cop, politician, and rival as a pawn on their chessboard. But even kings have to keep moving. The Bronx could only hold Dutch for so long. Across the river, Manhattan glimmered like forbidden fruit. The money there was different, cleaner, bigger, more dangerous. The Italian and Irish mobs had carved up the city like a pie, each claiming slices of power. But Dutch wanted it all. He saw the potential in Manhattan's speakeasies, its high-end clubs, and its powerful connections. The Bronx had made him rich. Manhattan, he believed, would make him untouchable. When Dutch moved into Manhattan, he did it like a general invading foreign land. His men flooded the nightclubs, offering protection or forcing it. Bars that refused his beer suddenly found their deliveries hijacked, their windows shattered, their bartenders beaten half to death. Within months, his brand of beer was pouring from taps across the borough. The newspapers called it the Schultz beer empire, but behind the flashy headlines were bodies buried in the dark. Still, it wasn't all violence. Dutch had a strange kind of charisma, something magnetic that drew people in even when they knew he was poison. He had a way of talking that made you believe he could make anyone rich, anyone powerful. He laughed loudly, tipped extravagantly, and dressed like a man who had conquered his destiny. But under that charm was a temper so fierce it terrified even his own men. One wrong word, one careless glance, and the same hand that had fed you could pull the trigger. One night, in a smoky bar on Lexington Avenue, a bartender made the mistake of shortchanging him. Dutch didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at the man, reached into his coat, and pulled out his gun. One shot right through the bar. The man collapsed before he even realized what had happened. The place fell silent. Dutch holstered his weapon, threw a few bills on the counter, and said calmly, "Now he's got the right change." Then he walked out. That was Dutch, calm one second, deadly the next. His unpredictability was his greatest weapon. By the mid-1920s, Dutch was at the height of his power. He was earning millions every year, laundering it through fake businesses and corrupt politicians. He controlled breweries in Yonkers, distribution routes stretching into New Jersey, and an army of thugs who carried out his orders without question. He dined with judges, bribed detectives, and sent flowers to their wives. The city's underworld revolved around him like planets around a star. But success is the most dangerous illusion in the world. It makes men think they're gods. And gods don't fear consequences. Dutch began to believe his own myth. He started drinking heavily, throwing parties that blurred into mornings. The paranoia that would later consume him was already there, small, invisible, like cracks forming in the foundation of a mansion. He began to suspect his men of stealing, his partners of scheming, his allies of plotting his downfall. The Italians were watching, too. Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and others were building something new, a national crime syndicate, an organized council that made decisions based on logic, not emotion. Dutch, with his temper and arrogance, didn't fit their vision. He was too wild, too loud, too unpredictable. Luciano once described him as a man who'd rather blow up a bridge than cross it. Still, they tolerated him, at least for now, because his beer empire was too valuable to destroy. The Prohibition years were golden for Dutch. Every barrel of beer, every glass poured under his control, was money in his pocket. But the streets were shifting. The Irish mob was losing ground, the Italians were gaining it, and the cops were no longer as easy to buy as they used to be. The federal government had started cracking down harder, raiding breweries, seizing trucks, tightening the noose. Dutch didn't care. He simply paid more, bribed higher, threatened louder. It worked, until it didn't. One winter evening, as snow blanketed the city, Dutch called a meeting in one of his warehouses. His men gathered around him, their breath visible in the cold air, their faces tense. A shipment had gone missing, thousands of dollars worth of beer, hijacked somewhere on its way to Manhattan. Dutch paced slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Somebody," he said quietly, "made a mistake." His voice was calm, but his eyes burned like blue fire. "I don't tolerate mistakes." No one spoke. The silence was unbearable. Then Dutch pointed to one of his drivers, a young man barely 20, and said, "You were on that route." The driver stammered, tried to explain. But before he could finish, Dutch pulled his gun and shot him in the stomach. The others didn't move. They just watched as their boss turned away, his face expressionless. "Clean this up," he muttered, lighting a cigarette. That was how Dutch Schultz kept order, through fear so thick you could taste it. Despite his cruelty, his legend kept growing. Reporters followed his trials, politicians whispered his name, and the public, in some twisted way, admired him. He was the outlaw they couldn't help but respect, the working-class man who defied the system and won. But deep down, Dutch knew how fragile his empire really was. One bad shipment, one double cross, one unlucky day could bring it all crashing down. Then came the day that changed everything. A raid on one of his breweries led to multiple arrests. Dutch narrowly escaped, but the cops had names, ledgers, routes. His carefully built operation suddenly had cracks. To make matters worse, federal agents were getting smarter, tracing shipments through coded invoices. Dutch's empire was bleeding money, and for the first time he felt the chill of uncertainty. He gathered his men in a back room that night, smoke swirling through the air. "The law thinks they can take us down," he said. "They can't. You know why? Because I built this city's thirst. Every man, every cop, every priest drinks what we sell. They'll never stop drinking, so they'll never stop needing me." His men cheered, their loyalty renewed by his fire. But even as he spoke, Dutch knew he was lying, to them and to himself. The city was changing faster than he could control. His enemies were multiplying, and in the shadows, powerful men were waiting for him to make one wrong move. Dutch Schultz had conquered the Bronx with brute force, but Manhattan was a different beast. A beast that didn't fear him, a beast that would one day devour him whole. For now, though, he still ruled the night. The beer flowed, the money piled high, and the cops looked the other way. From the window of his penthouse suite, Dutch watched the city glitter beneath him, unaware or perhaps unwilling to admit that every empire, no matter how strong, eventually rots from within. He poured himself a drink, his reflection flickering in the glass. "To the empire," he whispered. The taste was bitter, but it didn't matter. He'd built his kingdom from the dirt, and as far as he was concerned, no one, lawman, rival, or devil himself, was going to take it from him. Not yet, but somewhere, in the dark alleys of Harlem and the smoke-filled rooms of the Italian mob, his name was already being discussed. His success had made him a target, and in the world Dutch Schultz ruled, power didn't just attract attention, it painted a bullseye on your back. The night sky over Manhattan was heavy with rain and smoke, the kind of air that made the city feel alive, pulsing with something dark and electric. Inside a dimly lit club on 145th Street, Dutch Schultz sat in his usual corner booth, his eyes scanning the room through the haze of cigar smoke. The place throbbed with jazz, laughter, and whispers, the language of Prohibition nightlife. Harlem was booming, and Schultz had made sure he got his share of it. The club wasn't just a place for music and drinks. It was part of a vast machine, one that turned illegal beer into rivers of cash. Every bottle served meant money in Dutch's pocket. and the rhythm of the city seemed to beat in time with his empire. But this was no longer the simple Bronx beer trade. Dutch had moved into something far more complex and dangerous, the Harlem numbers racket. It was a game of chance played by thousands of poor black New Yorkers, a street lottery that offered hope for pennies. Until now, it had been mostly run by the black community itself, people like Stephanie St. Clair, the Madam Queen of Policy, and her enforcer, Bumpy Johnson. They weren't gangsters in the traditional sense. They were business people protecting their own turf. But to Dutch Schultz, turf was just another word for opportunity. He had conquered breweries and bars, fought the Irish, outwitted the police. Harlem, he thought, would be no different. So he sent his men north with an offer. The Madam Queen would hand over a percentage of her profits, and in return, Dutch would provide protection. She refused, of course. Harlem wasn't the Bronx, and she wasn't afraid of men like him. Dutch didn't like being told no. The first refusals led to broken windows, burned storefronts, and men found in alleys with bullets in their skulls. It was the beginning of a war fought not for beer, but for power. The newspapers didn't write much about it. The white press barely acknowledged the violence uptown, but in Harlem everyone knew. People whispered Schultz's name with hatred. He was the outsider, the invader who wanted to bleed their streets dry. Yet as brutal as he was methodical. Dutch moved with the precision of a businessman, replacing fear with strategy. He bribed cops in Harlem precincts, paid off politicians, and forced small-time policy runners to switch allegiance. Each week, his envelope men collected thousands in cash. Harlem's dreams were slowly being written in Dutch's ledger books. But with power came danger. The Italians were watching from the sidelines. Lucky Luciano and the Commission had eyes everywhere, and Dutch's Harlem expansion was making them nervous. It wasn't just that he was taking money out of their pockets. It was that he was doing it without their blessing. Dutch had never respected authority, not even among criminals. He refused to pay tribute to the mafia, refused to play by their new rules. To him, they were nothing more than bureaucrats in suits, trying to control what real men had built with fists and bullets. Luciano didn't forget the insult. In back rooms and restaurants, quiet conversations began about Dutch, his arrogance, his unpredictability. They all agreed on one thing: Dutch Schultz was becoming a problem. Back in Harlem, Dutch's men were fighting daily skirmishes with St. Clair's and Johnson's people. Shootings, bombings, kidnappings, each side striking back harder than the last. Dutch responded the only way he knew how, with overwhelming force. One of his men, a hulking enforcer named Lulu Rosenkrantz, became infamous for storming into gambling dens, firing shots into the ceiling, and demanding tribute in Dutch's name. The violence was so relentless that Harlem's streets ran with blood. And yet, despite the terror, Dutch was making money hand over fist. The Harlem numbers racket was worth millions, and every week his control tightened. Still, something in Dutch had changed. Maybe it was the constant pressure or the growing whispers of betrayal, but he'd become more erratic. He started drinking heavily, gin for breakfast, whiskey for dinner. The once sharp businessman was now unpredictable, prone to violent rages over the smallest slights. He'd storm into meetings drunk, slam his gun on the table, and threaten to kill anyone who disagreed with him. His men began to fear him more than they respected him. Otto Berman, ever the quiet observer, noticed it first. "The boss is slipping," he muttered one night, counting stacks of cash. Bo Weinberg just nodded, his jaw tight. They both knew what it meant. Dutch was rich, filthy rich, but he was also alone. Money had bought him power, not peace. He couldn't sleep without a gun under his pillow. He couldn't walk down the street without looking over his shoulder. Every friend was a potential traitor, every deal a potential trap. The paranoia ate at him like rot. The government hadn't forgotten him either. Thomas Dewey, the young U.S. attorney, had made a name for himself by taking down mobsters through tax evasion charges. He'd sent Al Capone to prison, and now his sights were set on Dutch Schultz. Dewey wasn't like the crooked cops Dutch had bought for years. He was sharp, fearless, and clean, a man who couldn't be bribed or bullied. The newspapers loved him. The people saw him as a hero. Dutch saw him as a threat. When the subpoenas came, Dutch laughed them off. But Dewey wasn't bluffing. Federal agents raided breweries, seized records, and froze assets. For the first time in years, Dutch's empire started to wobble. He called emergency meetings, shouting at his accountants, accusing his men of incompetence. Otto Berman tried to reason with him, explaining that the law's reach was tightening. "You can't shoot your way out of this one," Otto said quietly. Dutch slammed his fist on the desk. "The hell I can't." To Dutch, violence was always the answer. He'd spent his life using it to solve problems, and now he intended to use it again, this time against the United States government. He told his men he wanted Dewey dead. It wasn't just anger, it was obsession. Dewey had humiliated him, dragged his name through the papers, frozen his accounts. Killing him, Dutch believed, would send a message. No one, not even the law, could touch him. But the plan terrified his inner circle. Killing a federal prosecutor would bring the full weight of Washington down on them. Even the mafia wanted no part of it. Luciano and the others called an emergency meeting. Dutch's recklessness was bad for business, and business was the only thing that mattered to them. When word spread that he was planning to assassinate Dewey, the commission made a decision. Dutch Schultz had to go. He didn't know it yet, but the vote had already been cast. Meanwhile, Dutch continued to spiral. He was drinking more, sleeping less, and trusting no one. His once loyal men began to whisper about leaving. Even Bo Weinberg, his most trusted lieutenant, had grown distant. Dutch suspected betrayal everywhere. He'd stare into the mirror late at night, muttering to himself, replaying old battles, convincing himself that everyone, friends, enemies, even fate, was conspiring to destroy him. His empire, once vast and strong, began to crumble from within. Trucks went missing. Police raids increased. Politicians stopped returning his calls. Harlem slipped from his grasp as quickly as he'd taken it. Bumpy Johnson and the Madame Queen slowly reclaimed what was theirs, backed quietly by the Italians who wanted Schultz gone. But Dutch was too blind to see it. To him, every loss was a temporary setback. He believed his name still carried weight, that fear alone could keep his world intact. It was pride, not reason, that guided him now. The same pride that had made him powerful was leading him straight to his end. In the summer of 1935, Dutch fled the city, retreating to upstate New York under a fake name. He claimed it was to escape the heat, but everyone knew he was running from more than just the law. His once flashy suits were replaced by rumpled clothes, his confident swagger by restless pacing. He spent his nights in cheap hotel bars, surrounded by men who no longer respected him, muttering about conspiracies and revenge. Sometimes, in his drunken ramblings, he'd talk about the old days, the Bronx, the breweries, the first taste of power. His voice would soften, almost nostalgic, but then the rage would return. "They all turned on me," he'd say. "They think I'm finished. I'll show them." He'd slam his glass down, demanding another drink, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. In truth, Dutch Schultz was already a ghost, alive, but hollow. His empire had dissolved into fragments, his fortune seized, his men scattered. All that remained was his name, and even that was starting to fade. Yet in his mind, he was still the beer baron of New York, the king who couldn't be dethroned. He didn't know it yet, but the world was preparing to bury him. Somewhere in a smoky back room in Manhattan, the decision had been made. Dutch Schultz, once feared by the city, was now marked for death. And as the rain fell over Newark one October night, his final chapter began to write itself. The night of October 23rd, 1935, was damp and cold, the kind of night where the city's pulse slowed just enough for shadows to move unseen. In Newark, New Jersey, the Palace Chop House was half empty, a dim tavern tucked beneath flickering neon. Inside, Dutch Schultz sat at a corner table with a handful of men: Otto Abadaba Berman, his aging accountant; Lulu Rosenkrantz, his bodyguard; Abe Landau, his loyal gunman; and a young errand boy named Bernard Bo, Weinberg's brother-in-law, who waited nervously near the door. The smell of whiskey and cigar smoke hung thick, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with the low hum of conversations that carried the unease of men who knew their luck was running out. Dutch looked tired. His face, once sharp and full of swagger, now carried the weight of paranoia and sleepless nights. He had been running from subpoenas, from cops, from old friends who no longer returned his calls. He still dreamed of killing Thomas Dewey, the man who had become his obsession, but everyone around him knew that dream had already signed his death warrant. Even now, as he sat sipping whiskey, there was a tremor in his hand. He wasn't the king of New York anymore, just another outlaw hiding from his own shadow. Otto was doing what he always did, quietly calculating numbers, trying to keep some kind of order amid the chaos. Lulu cracked jokes between mouthfuls of roast beef, pretending nothing was wrong, but his laughter sounded forced. Abe Landau sat silently, scanning the room, his hand never straying far from the gun tucked beneath his coat. Dutch's men had grown used to this. Meals that felt like last suppers, conversations that went nowhere. Dutch was talking nonsense again, muttering about moving to Arizona, about making a comeback, about buying new breweries out west. He spoke of the future like a man who couldn't see the cliff at his feet. Outside, 2 cars pulled up to the curb. The engines idled for a moment, and then 4 men stepped out. They weren't locals. Their suits were clean, their faces expressionless, their purpose clear. They were soldiers from New York, sent by the commission. Dutch Schultz's luck had officially run out. Inside, the waiter, a nervous man with slicked hair, brought another round of drinks. Dutch leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. "You know," he said, his words slightly slurred, "they all think they can push me out. Luciano, Lansky, all of them. They forget who built this city." He smirked and raised his glass. "To the Bronx, to Harlem. To me." Lulu lifted his own glass half-heartedly. Otto didn't bother. At 10:15 p.m., the door to the Palace Chop House swung open. A cold gust swept through as 2 men entered, pretending to be customers. They moved with quiet purpose, their hands already hidden beneath their coats. The waiter froze mid-step. For a split second, the world seemed to pause. Dutch, sensing something off, turned his head, and then the room exploded with gunfire. The first bullets hit Abe Landau square in the chest. He toppled backward, crashing into the table. Lulu reached for his gun but caught a round in the stomach before he could draw. Otto tried to stand, confused as blood splattered across his papers. Dutch was hit last, 2 shots, one tearing through his abdomen, another grazing his shoulder. The sound was deafening, plates shattering, glasses exploding into shards. Within seconds, the assassins turned and fled, leaving chaos in their wake. The restaurant fell silent except for the groans of the dying. Dutch was slumped in his chair, pale and trembling, clutching his stomach. Blood seeped through his fingers, pooling on the floor. Lulu lay beside him, gasping for air. Abe Landau was motionless. Otto Berman, the old accountant, had collapsed across the table, his spectacles cracked, his face still wearing a look of shock. The smell of gunpowder lingered, heavy and final. When the police arrived minutes later, they found Dutch still alive. He was delirious but conscious, muttering strange things, his words slipping between English and German. They rushed him to Newark City Hospital, where doctors frantically operated. It was a miracle he had survived the initial barrage, but the bullets had done their damage. The doctor said it was only a matter of time, and then, in those final hours, Dutch Schultz began to talk. What came out of his mouth that night would become legend, a rambling, feverish monologue that made no sense to anyone but perhaps him. Reporters called it the Schultz dying monologue, a stream of words that drifted between memory, guilt, and madness. "A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kim," he murmured. "Mother is the best bet. Get the money in the can." The detectives leaned in, trying to find meaning, hoping he might name his killers. But there was no logic, only fragments of a man's life flashing before his eyes. Some said he was hallucinating his childhood in the Bronx, his mother's face, his first fights on the streets. Others believed he was seeing ghosts, those he'd killed, those he'd betrayed. The truth was simpler. Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of New York, was dying the way he'd lived, angry, incoherent, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him beg. He lasted 22 hours. Through it all, he ranted, whispered, and laughed. When a priest arrived to offer last rites, Dutch waved him off. "I'm not afraid," he said. "Nobody's going to kill me." The irony, cruel and sharp, hung in the air. When he finally went silent, the nurses thought he was asleep, but he never woke again. Dutch Schultz was pronounced dead on October 24, 1935. He was 33 years old. News of his death spread fast. Newspapers across the country ran headlines, "Beer baron gunned down. Schultz slain in Newark." Crowds gathered outside the hospital, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous gangster's body. In New York, the underworld barely paused. Luciano and the commission met quietly, satisfied that the Dewey problem had been solved without bringing the wrath of the government down on them. To them, Dutch had been a loose cannon, Necessary once, but dangerous in the end. His death wasn't a tragedy. It was maintenance. At his funeral, only a handful of people showed up. The man who had once ruled half the city was lowered into the ground without fanfare, without tears. His mother wept quietly beside the casket, while 2 detectives stood nearby watching. Most of his old crew had either vanished or been killed. His empire was gone, carved up by rivals before the dirt even hit his grave. But death didn't end Dutch Schultz's story. Rumors began to spread almost immediately, rumors of hidden money. Before his death, Dutch had been obsessed with keeping his fortune safe from both the law and his enemies. Some said he'd buried millions somewhere in upstate New York, in the woods near Phoenicia or the Catskills. He'd supposedly filled a steel box with cash, bonds and gold coins, and hidden it beneath a tree, marking the spot with a mysterious X. The location, they said, died with him. Treasure hunters still search for it today, wandering through forests with metal detectors and old maps, chasing the ghost of a man who lived for greed and died for pride. It's a fitting legacy, a fortune that can never be found, belonging to a man who could never be satisfied. But beneath the legend, there's another truth, a darker one. Dutch Schultz was a product of his time, a man born in poverty who clawed his way to power during an era that rewarded brutality. He wasn't smarter than his enemies, just hungrier. The law, the mafia, even his own men, all were pawns in his desperate quest to control a city that refused to be owned. His downfall wasn't fate. It was inevitability. You can't build an empire on blood without drowning in it eventually, and yet in some way, Dutch's ghost still lingers. In every story of greed, every criminal who believes he's untouchable, you can hear echoes of his voice. Arrogant, defiant, doomed. His story is a warning dressed as legend. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the city hums quietly under the glow of street lamps, it's easy to imagine him still there, the restless spirit of the beer baron, wandering between the alleys of Harlem and the bars of the Bronx, muttering about the empire that slipped through his fingers. Somewhere, maybe, his treasure waits, untouched, like his memory, buried, but never gone. Because men like Dutch Schultz don't really disappear. They fade into the myths that cities tell themselves, the myths of power, corruption, and the price of immortality. And as the last page of his life turned, the world didn't mourn him. It simply moved on, the same way it always does when another king of crime falls. Dutch Schultz was just another name in the endless story of New York's underworld, a story written in beer, blood, and betrayal. But for a brief, blazing moment, he had ruled it all. When the bullets stopped echoing in the tiled walls of the Palace Chop House, it wasn't just the end of Dutch Schultz's life. It was the end of an era. The underworld of New York was changing. The bootleggers were gone, the old beer barons either dead or scattered, and in their place rose a new kind of criminal, organized, calculated, corporate. The city that once bowed to the roar of Tommy guns was learning to whisper deals instead. Schultz's death was a warning, a final punctuation mark on the wild chaos of Prohibition. In the weeks that followed, his empire disintegrated like smoke. The breweries he once owned were raided, his remaining men either flipped by the authorities or swallowed by rival gangs. The Bronx warehouses stood empty, their wooden floors still sticky with the residue of beer and blood. The cops who once took bribes from Dutch now strutted around, pretending they'd been part of his downfall all along. Reporters spun the tale as if justice had triumphed, but those who lived in the city's shadows knew better. Dutch hadn't been killed by the law. He'd been erased by his own kind. Lucky Luciano, sitting in a quiet restaurant in Midtown, raised his glass in a silent toast when he heard the news. One less problem, he said simply. To him, Schultz had been a relic of the old, loud, reckless gangsters who let pride dictate their moves. Luciano's world was different. He believed in structure, in alliances, in a system that made killing unnecessary except when absolutely required. Dutch Schultz had broken the one rule that mattered. He thought he was bigger than the game. In Harlem, there was celebration. Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson heard about Dutch's death with a satisfaction that needed no words. For months, their people had lived under fear, their businesses bombed, their runners beaten, their money stolen. Now the man responsible was gone, and the streets of Harlem belonged to them again. But even victory had its bitterness. Bumpy knew the Italians had orchestrated it, not out of justice, but because Schultz had become inconvenient. Harlem's independence was still fragile. The mafia didn't invade with guns anymore. They used control, money, and strategy. Still, for that one night, Harlem breathed freely. Back in the Bronx, Dutch's mother sat in her small apartment, staring at a photo of her son. To her, he was still Arthur Flegenheimer, the boy who used to run errands for the grocer, who brought home flowers on Sundays. She refused to read the newspapers. She didn't want to see his name turned into spectacle. To her, he wasn't a gangster. He was just her son, lost to a world that had never forgiven the poor for wanting more. When the funeral came, she stood by the casket alone, her tears quiet, her hand trembling as she touched the cold wood. No priests, no mourners, no grand ceremony, just silence. The government, meanwhile, claimed victory. Thomas Dewey's office released a statement celebrating the end of one of New York's most violent figures. Dewey himself, though, said little. He didn't need to. The press crowned him a hero, a man whose crusade against organized crime had struck fear into the underworld. In truth, Dewey hadn't pulled the trigger, but he didn't mind taking the credit. His political career would rise on the ashes of men like Schultz. But somewhere in that gray space between law and legend, Dutch's story refused to die. The rumors about his hidden fortune spread like wildfire. Millions in cash, gold, and bonds buried in the hills of upstate New York. Some claimed Dutch had confided in Otto Berman before his death, telling him about a cache near Esopus Creek, hidden in a steel box under a tree marked with an X. Others swore Lulu Rosencrantz had taken the secret to his grave. The more people speculated, the less anyone knew. For decades after his death, treasure hunters combed the forests with shovels and metal detectors, chasing whispers that had long since faded into myth. None ever found it. But the legend of Schultz's treasure lived on. A ghost story told around campfires and taverns, an echo of greed that refused to stay buried. In the underworld, Dutch's death served as a lesson. The young gangsters who came after him learned to move quieter, think sharper, and never let emotion cloud business. Luciano and Meyer Lansky built an empire based on that philosophy, creating the Commission, a council of organized crime families that divided territory, settled disputes, and kept chaos in check. Schultz had been one of the last to reject their order. He believed in power through fear, not diplomacy. His death proved which method would rule the new century. But there was another side to Dutch's story that few ever spoke about. Beneath the headlines and the body counts was a man haunted by his own beginnings. He'd grown up in the Bronx, the son of German Jewish immigrants, surrounded by poverty and struggle. The streets taught him that the only language that mattered was power. Every insult, every beating, every slight burned into him until ambition became obsession. To Dutch, success wasn't about money. It was about proving he could rise above the world that had once spat on him. That hunger had driven him to everything he became. It was what made him ruthless, what made him build his empire with fists and fear. But it was also what destroyed him. Because once he'd conquered everything, once he'd turned himself into a king, there was nowhere left to climb. Paranoia filled the space where ambition used to be. He couldn't trust his friends, couldn't forgive betrayal, couldn't stop fighting enemies who no longer existed. The same streets that had made him now swallowed him whole. In that way, Dutch Schultz wasn't just a criminal, he was a reflection of the era that birthed him. Prohibition America was a place built on contradictions, moral on paper, corrupt in practice. Politicians preached virtue while taking bribes. Cops enforced the law while drinking the very liquor they seized. Ordinary people broke the law just to live. In that chaos, men like Schultz thrived. They didn't create corruption, they simply made it visible. He was the embodiment of a country learning to trade honesty for survival. As the years passed, his name began to fade from headlines. New villains took his place: Luciano, Genovese, Anastasia, Costello. Dutch became a cautionary tale, a ghost from a time when men shot their way to the top instead of talking their way there. Yet in old bars in the Bronx, the older men still told his story. They remembered the nights when his trucks rolled down the avenues, filled with beer that flowed like gold. They remembered the fear he inspired, the headlines that screamed his name. To them, he was more than a criminal. He was part of the city's fabric. A reminder that power, once tasted, could never be forgotten. And sometimes, when the fog rolled over the East River and the city's lights shimmered like ghosts, people swore they could still see him. A shadow in an alley, a man in an old fedora watching from a doorway, a faint echo of laughter where there should be none. Dutch Schultz, Arthur Flegenheimer, refused to disappear entirely. But perhaps the most haunting part of his story was how quickly the world replaced him. The city didn't pause to mourn. The beer still flowed, the money still moved, the crime still thrived. Dutch had believed he was indispensable, that without him the empire would crumble. He was wrong. The empire didn't belong to any one man. It belonged to the streets themselves, to the endless cycle of greed and blood that would always find new faces to wear the crown. In that sense, Dutch's death wasn't an ending, it was a transition. The chaos of the old gangs gave way to the order of the mafia. The beer barons were replaced by businessmen in silk suits. The violence became quieter, more efficient, but no less brutal. Dutch's fall was the price of evolution. Even so, his legend endured in strange places. Writers and filmmakers would later use his story as inspiration, the wild, paranoid gangster who built an empire and lost it to his own madness. Songs mentioned his name, poems tried to capture his final, delirious words. He became a symbol of the Roaring Twenties corruption. A ghost from a time when men could build kingdoms out of bootleg beer and bullets, and somewhere, deep in those cold woods of upstate New York, people still dig for the treasure. They still believe that beneath some forgotten tree lies a steel box filled with the last remnants of Dutch Schultz's empire. Maybe it's there. Maybe it never was. But that's the thing about men like Dutch. They blur the line between fact and legend until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The city moved on, as it always does. But for those who know its darker history, his story remains a quiet reminder. It tells us that ambition without restraint leads only one way, down. That fear can build empires, but it can't sustain them. That even kings fall, especially those who believe they can outgun fate. Years later, when Meyer Lansky was asked about Schultz, he said simply, "He was a man who couldn't see the future." That was true. Dutch was a creature of his moment, unable to adapt to the rules of the new order. He fought until the end, convinced that raw power was all that mattered. He never understood that power, without control, is just another kind of death. So his story ends not with redemption, but with echoes in the streets he once ruled, in the bars that still play jazz under the hum of neon, in the dreams of men who still chase easy money and immortality. The beer baron of New York, gone but not forgotten. His empire dissolved, but his legend alive in the cracks of the city that made him. Because in the end, every empire falls, but every ghost lingers, and in the city of endless nights, Dutch Schultz still whispers through the rain. The years after Dutch Schultz's death rolled forward like a fog drifting over the East River, slow, inevitable, and heavy with silence. The newspapers, which once screamed his name across their front pages, had moved on to newer scandals, fresher blood. But in the corners of the city he once ruled, his ghost lingered. Men still spoke his name in bars thick with cigarette smoke, still swapped stories about his hidden millions, still swore they'd once seen him drinking alone long after he was supposed to be dead. He had become part myth, part warning, a spirit that haunted the city's conscience, a symbol of what happened when greed outgrew reason. In the Bronx, the remnants of his empire decayed. The breweries stood empty, the machinery rusted, their windows shattered by vandals. The warehouses that had once smelled of beer and sweat and money were now hollow shells, home only to rats and echoes. Every now and then, an old-timer passing by would pause, glance at the crumbling brick and remember the sound of trucks rumbling down the avenue, the laughter of men unloading crates, the clink of bottles that once bought them all a taste of the American dream. To those who had lived through it, Schultz's reign felt like another lifetime. The men who had once served under him scattered like ashes in the wind. Some tried to join other gangs, offering their services to the Italians or the Irish. Others fled the life entirely, taking whatever cash they could steal and disappearing into small towns under fake names. But a few met darker fates. One by one, those who had been closest to Schultz began to vanish. Bo Weinberg, once his trusted lieutenant, had already been executed months before Dutch's own death, killed by Luciano's orders, cemented in the foundation of a warehouse somewhere in the Bronx, if the whispers were true. Others were found floating in the river, their loyalty paid back in silence. The underworld had no room for ghosts of old regimes. Still, there were a few who couldn't let go of the past. Detectives, treasure hunters, journalists. They all found themselves drawn to the mystery Dutch had left behind. The hidden fortune became an obsession. Some swore it was $5 million, others said 7, buried somewhere in the Catskills in a metal box. Theories spread like wildfire. One story claimed Schultz had hidden it near a trout stream he loved. Another said it was beneath a barn owned by one of his mistresses. The truth was no one knew, but the not knowing was what kept the legend alive. Each year, someone new would show up in the woods north of New York, shovel in hand, guided by old maps and false hope. They came from everywhere, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, even as far as Ohio, chasing the dream of finding the lost fortune of a dead gangster. Some claimed to have found traces, an old rusted lock, a dented box, scraps of paper that could have been anything. Others swore they saw strange lights in the forest at night, heard whispers in the trees, as if Dutch himself was still guarding his gold. They called it Schultz's curse, that anyone who searched for the treasure with greed in their heart would never find it, or worse, meet a bad end. It sounded like superstition, but in New York, stories like that had a way of feeling true. For the underworld, the death of Dutch Schultz was more than the end of a man. It was the end of a style of crime. He had been the last of the wild bootleggers, the reckless street kings who ruled with fists and fear. After him came the era of order. Lucky Luciano's commission formalized the mafia into a business. The days of spontaneous gunfights in restaurants were replaced by quiet meetings in cigar smoke-filled rooms where decisions were made over wine instead of whiskey. The Italians took everything Dutch had fought for, his territories, his connections, even some of his old breweries. But they learned from his mistakes. They paid the politicians instead of threatening them. They smiled before they shot. They built empires that would last for decades. Thomas Dewey, the man Dutch had wanted dead, became a symbol of the other side of that war. His victory over gangsters propelled him into the national spotlight. He was clean-cut, ambitious, the face of law and order. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the man Dutch had wanted to kill became one of the most powerful figures in America, even running for president one day. If Dutch could have seen it, he would have laughed, or maybe he would have raged. Either way, it was a reminder that no matter how powerful a man thinks he is, the world always finds a way to move on without him. But not everyone forgot. In Harlem, the memory of Dutch Schultz lived differently. To the people who had suffered under his reign, his death wasn't just another mob story, it was justice. They remembered the fear, the bombs, the shootings, the bodies left in the gutters when he tried to muscle his way into their neighborhood. They remembered the courage of the Madam Queen, Stephanie St. Clair, who had stood her ground against a white gangster backed by cops and killers. Harlem's storytellers turned her defiance into legend. Dutch was the villain in their tale, the monster slain by fate itself. Yet even there, in whispered stories told over cheap whiskey and smoky clubs, some admitted he had a strange, haunting charisma. They said when Dutch walked into a room, you felt the air change. He was magnetic and terrifying all at once, a man who could charm you while deciding whether to kill you. Years later, historians would argue over him. Was he a madman, a genius, a victim of his own ambition? They'd pore over court records, wiretaps, interviews, trying to piece together the truth. But the truth was always slippery when it came to men like Dutch. He was all those things, and none of them. He could be generous one minute, brutal the next. He'd give a poor family money for rent, then order a man shot in front of his children an hour later. To understand him, you had to understand the city that made him, a place of endless hunger, where survival demanded both heart and cruelty. And maybe that was why people couldn't stop talking about him. Because Dutch Schultz wasn't just one man's story. He was the story of New York itself, its greed, its ambition, its beauty and decay. He was the reflection of a city that devoured its own. One winter night, a journalist named Paul Connors sat in a small bar in the Bronx, staring at a crumpled notebook filled with old quotes and rumors about Schultz. He'd been researching a book about Prohibition for months, and somehow, every trail led back to the same man. Connors had interviewed retired detectives, aging mobsters, even one of Schultz's former drivers who now worked as a janitor in a church. They all told different stories, but one thing was always the same. Dutch was a force of nature, impossible to predict, impossible to forget. The janitor had said something that stuck with him. You know what Dutch wanted most? Respect, that's all. He wanted people to say his name and tremble a little. He thought if he got enough money, enough power, maybe that'd make him somebody. But in the end, it made him a ghost. Connors closed his notebook and looked out the window. Snow was falling softly over the street, covering the cracked sidewalks, the flickering lights. Somewhere in that snow, buried under decades of change, were the footprints of a man who had once ruled this borough like a king. And now, only stories remained. By the 1950s, the treasure hunters had become part of local folklore. Newspapers ran occasional features, the lost fortune of Dutch Schultz, with grainy photos of men holding shovels in frozen fields. None of them ever found anything, but the idea refused to die. There was something poetic about it, the notion that a man who had once owned everything could still drive people to madness long after he was gone. And every once in a while, someone claimed to have cracked the mystery. A map found in an attic, a confession from a dying man, a strange metal box unearthed by construction workers. Each time, hope would flare up, only to fade again when the evidence proved false. But the legend was stronger than the truth. People wanted to believe that somewhere, deep in the cold earth, the soul of Dutch Schultz was still guarding his empire, his last grasp at immortality. It's strange how the dead can have more power than the living. Dutch had built his world with guns and beer, but it was his myth that endured. His name survived not because of his crimes, but because of what he represented: the hunger for more, the defiance of fate, the belief that one man could bend the world to his will. That was the heart of every gangster story, and Dutch embodied it perfectly, even now. When you walk through the Bronx on a quiet night, when the streetlights flicker and the wind carries the faint hum of distant traffic, you can almost feel him. You can picture him in his pinstripe suit, hat tilted just so, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes sharp and watchful. The city has changed, but some ghosts never leave. They just blend into the rhythm, into the heartbeat of the streets. For the men who came after, Dutch Schultz was both a warning and a legend. A warning that power built on rage will always burn out, and a legend that no one can truly kill. And maybe that's how he wanted it. In the years that followed Dutch Schultz's death, New York transformed, but the echoes of his reign still lingered like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. The city was cleaner on the surface, yet beneath the shine of new construction and political promises, corruption still pulsed through its veins. Dutch had been gone for more than a decade, but his legend was alive, twisting, mutating, passed between generations like a whispered curse. To some, he was a relic of a more chaotic time, a wild dog who couldn't be tamed. To others, he was a symbol of defiance, a man who had tried to seize destiny by the throat, even if it meant choking on it himself. But every myth has its keepers, and in dark bars and quiet alleyways, there were still men who claimed to have known him, still men who spoke his name with a strange mix of awe and fear. One of them was Benny the Tailor Glick, an old numbers man who'd once run errands for Schultz in the Bronx. By the late 1940s, Benny was a frail old man with trembling hands, sitting at the back of a failing tailor shop where no one came for suits anymore. Yet people still came to hear him talk. He told his stories in a low, raspy voice, as if each word might betray him to someone still listening. "Dutch," he would say. "Dutch wasn't crazy. He was careful. He just thought the world was his, and for a while it was." His eyes would go distant then, staring past the dust and the fading light. He could walk into a room and make grown men sweat, but he'd look at a kid selling papers on the corner and toss him $1. You couldn't figure him out. You could only follow or die. Benny's tales spread across the boroughs, carried by reporters looking for nostalgia and by young gangsters hungry for meaning. Dutch's image began to take on a life of its own, a saint of the street, a devil of ambition. In Harlem, where he'd once tried to crush the numbers racket, his name became part of a different story. Old-timers remembered the chaos he brought, the bullets that whistled through tenement windows, the fear in the faces of shopkeepers when his men came calling, but they also remembered how Harlem fought back. Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson became legends precisely because they stood against him. Dutch was their villain, the shadow that made their defiance shine brighter. Without his cruelty, their courage might have gone unnoticed. By the 1950s, organized crime had evolved beyond the reckless violence that men like Schultz embodied. The mafia, under Luciano's vision, had turned crime into a corporate structure, disciplined, efficient, invisible. They no longer needed to blow up breweries or shoot rivals in restaurants. Deals were made in back rooms. Power passed through quiet handshakes and political favors. But the old guard, the men who had built their fortunes on blood and beer, still remembered Dutch. They spoke of him as one might speak of a fallen warrior. Mad, yes, but brave in a way that no longer existed. Frank Costello, who had once been both rival and reluctant ally, was rumored to have said at a private dinner, if Dutch had listened, he'd still be here. But he was too wild, too loud. You can't rule a kingdom if you keep setting it on fire. Others agreed. They admired his ferocity but pitied his blindness. Dutch had seen himself as a king, but kings die when they forget the throne isn't theirs alone. The lawmen, too, couldn't shake his ghost. Thomas Dewey's career continued to climb after Schultz's death. His triumph over the gangsters of New York cemented his reputation as the man who had tamed the city's criminal chaos. Yet in quiet moments, Dewey himself would recall the strange, almost mythical end of the beer baron. The newspapers had painted it as poetic justice, the mad dog dying in his own blood, babbling nonsense to detectives. But Dewey knew better. He knew that men like Dutch were not just criminals, they were reflections of the world that made them. Schultz was the child of poverty, violence, and a city that rewarded cunning over conscience. He was what happened when the American dream was filtered through desperation. Dewey would later say in a private interview, "We didn't kill Dutch Schultz, the city did." Meanwhile, the treasure stories grew wilder with every passing year. By the 1960s, treasure hunters had become almost a subculture, gathering in upstate bars, swapping maps and myths. A man named Arthur Two Dimes Perry claimed to have found the exact spot where Schultz buried his loot near Esopus Creek. He swore he'd found a rusted canteen and a few scraps of oilcloth, proof that the fortune was real. But just weeks later, Perry vanished. Some said he ran off with what he found. Others said he was murdered. The legend deepened. Every few years, a new article appeared in the papers. The lost millions of Dutch Schultz, always accompanied by grainy photos of rugged men digging in frozen mud. The FBI, when asked, denied ever finding anything, though rumors persisted that agents had once quietly searched a patch of woods near Phoenicia. Nothing ever came of it, but the myth was too strong to die. It became part of American folklore, the zoo. Idea that somewhere in those dark forests lay the last heartbeat of a gangster's dream. And perhaps that was fitting, because in life, Schultz had been a man driven by hunger, not for wealth alone, but for validation. Every brutal act, every deal, every explosion of rage seemed to stem from the same wound, the belief that the world had denied him respect. He wanted to be more than a street tough. He wanted to be remembered, and in that, he succeeded. Long after his empire turned to dust, people still spoke his name. In the 1970s, filmmakers rediscovered him. Gangster movies had become a new kind of mythology, and Dutch fit perfectly into that pantheon of doomed anti-heroes. He was the wild, unpredictable king who rose too fast, burned too bright, and fell too hard. Directors romanticized his life. Writers fictionalized his madness, turning his story into tragedy. The real Dutch Schultz, the man who laughed too loud, drank too much, and died mumbling prayers to a god he'd ignored, was gone. In his place stood a symbol, a cautionary tale wrapped in glamour. But the truth was darker. The truth was that Dutch had always been a man out of place. He came from an age when violence was personal, when power was earned through blood and terror. The new world of organized crime had no room for men like him. The modern mob valued silence, stability, control. Dutch was chaos incarnate. He couldn't be managed, couldn't be reasoned with. That was his greatness and his doom. There's an old story told by one of the last men who claimed to have seen Dutch alive. A crooked cop named Louis Carfano, who later disappeared himself. According to him, Dutch wasn't afraid in those final hours. Lying in that hospital bed, riddled with bullets, he didn't beg or weep. He rambled, yes, but in his own way, he was still fighting. Louis claimed Dutch looked up at him once and said, "Tell him I ain't done yet. I'll always come back," and maybe in a way he did. In the 1980s, during a renovation of a crumbling Bronx building once owned by one of his old fronts, workers unearthed a metal box buried in the basement. Inside were old coins, a faded ledger, and a few beer labels from Schultz's breweries. The papers were worthless, but the discovery reignited the legend. Newspapers ran headlines again. Dutch Schultz's secret cache found. For a brief moment, his name was everywhere once more. People lined up to see the artifacts when they were displayed at a local museum. Some swore the box was just the beginning, that the real treasure still waited, hidden somewhere in the cold earth, guarded by ghosts. By the time the 21st century arrived, Schultz had become part of the city's mythology, his story told in documentaries, podcasts, and history books. Tour guides in Manhattan would point out the spots where his breweries once stood, where his enemies had fallen, where he'd been gunned down. Tourists would listen, eyes wide, as if the story might somehow still be happening just around the corner. In a city that had seen everything, Dutch's legend endured because it carried something timeless: the hunger, the madness, the dream of control in a world that refused to be controlled. If you walked down Arthur Avenue on a quiet evening, you might pass old men sitting outside cafes arguing about the past. They'd talk about Luciano, Lansky, Siegel. But when someone mentioned Dutch Schultz, the tone changed. They'd lean in, voices low, as if discussing a secret. Dutch, one might say, shaking his head. He was trouble, but he was something else too. He had guts. Then they'd sip their coffee and fall silent, lost in the memory of a man who had once made the whole city tremble. In the end, Dutch Schultz didn't need his buried millions to achieve immortality. His real treasure was the story he left behind, the chaos, the contradictions, the mark on history that refused to fade. He became a legend because he was both everything people feared and everything they admired. The American dream had many faces, and Dutch's was one of the darkest. Even now, when the city sleeps and the wind howls through empty alleys, some swear you can still hear faint laughter echoing from the shadows, a cruel, defiant laugh that refuses to die. The sound of a man who once ruled the streets and dared to challenge fate itself. And maybe, somewhere out there, buried deep beneath the roots of a forgotten forest, lies that box of gold and dreams. Maybe it's still waiting for the right kind of man to find it, the kind who understands that every fortune comes with a curse, and every ghost still wants to be remembered. Because Dutch Schultz, for all his sins, achieved the one thing every gangster desires most. He became eternal. By the mid-1990s, the legend of Dutch Schultz had become something more than history. It had become folklore, stitched into the city's consciousness like an old scar that never fully healed. His story had been told so many times, reshaped and exaggerated by the mouths of barroom storytellers, journalists, professors, and even children daring each other to find his buried treasure, that the truth had blurred into myth. In a city built on ambition and memory, Dutch was the ghost that refused to fade. New York had seen countless gangsters rise and fall since his time. Yet there was something about Schultz that still lingered. His madness, his defiance, his strange mix of genius and chaos that set him apart. He wasn't just another mobster to be remembered for crimes. He was an archetype, a warning written in blood and beer. In one of those strange twists of fate, a young documentary filmmaker named Jacob Rains became obsessed with Schultz's story. Jacob had grown up in the Bronx, not far from where Dutch had once built his empire, and his grandfather used to tell him tales of the old gangster days, of men in fedoras, bootlegging trucks roaring through the night, gunfire echoing in alleys. When Jacob stumbled upon a yellowed newspaper clipping about the infamous treasure hunt in the Catskills, something inside him ignited. He decided he'd make a film, not just about Schultz's life, but about the myth that refused to die. Jacob's research took him deep into archives, police records, and old interviews. He found transcripts of the delirious ramblings Dutch had muttered in his final hours, words that read like fragments of a broken prophecy. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kin. Those strange phrases fascinated him. What did they mean? Was it madness, or was there something buried inside those words? Something hidden? Jacob played the recordings over and over, listening to the slurred tones, the rise and fall of Dutch's voice. imagining the dying gangster clutching at his final moments as detectives leaned in, desperate for answers. The deeper Jacob went, the more the lines blurred between fact and obsession. He began visiting the old haunts, the remains of the Bronx breweries, the sites of former speakeasies, even the woods near Phoenicia where treasure hunters had once dug. Each location felt charged, as if the air itself still carried remnants of Schultz's presence. Locals told him stories that sounded like hallucinations, strange lights flickering in the trees at night, voices whispering from underground, coins turning up in streams miles apart. Some claimed to have seen a shadowy figure watching from the tree line, wearing a fedora that glinted under the moonlight. Jacob knew it was nonsense. He was a filmmaker, a rational man, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Dutch's ghost was still out there, laughing at them all. He started to dream about him, dreams where Schultz sat across from him at a bar, smiling that crooked smile, pouring whiskey that never seemed to run out. "You're digging in the wrong place, kid," the ghost would whisper. "You're looking for gold, but all you'll find is a story." Jacob would wake in a sweat, his heart pounding, and scribble notes in the dark. Meanwhile, the myth of the buried treasure found new life online. The early internet, wild and chaotic, became the perfect breeding ground for conspiracy. Forums buzzed with theories about where Schultz's millions were hidden. One man posted grainy photos of what he claimed was an old map passed down through his family, a map with a crudely drawn X near Esopus Creek. Another insisted the fortune wasn't cash at, all but documents, bank codes, payoff ledgers, evidence that could have destroyed powerful men had they been found. Jacob's documentary started to attract attention. Journalists reached out, and soon he was featured in a small article titled, "The Man Chasing Dutch Schultz's Ghost." It was meant as a curiosity piece, but it caught the eye of someone unexpected, a retired detective named Frank Mullen, who had worked cold cases in the 1970s. Mullen contacted Jacob with a simple message: "I know where to start looking." They met in a diner off Route 28, the kind of place that hadn't changed since the 1950s. Mullen was in his late 70s, his face lined but sharp, his eyes still carrying that quiet intensity of a man who'd seen too much. He told Jacob that years ago he'd stumbled upon something strange in an old evidence box, an unmarked envelope containing a faded photograph of a wooded area, a rusted shovel leaning against a tree, and a handwritten note that read, "Behind the waterfall, near the cold spring." Mullen had dismissed it at the time as another wild lead in the endless Schultz treasure rumors, but now sitting across from Jacob he wasn't so sure. "The timing lines up," he said between sips of coffee. "The handwriting. I compared it once, just for curiosity. It matches one of Schultz's men, the handwriting of Lulu Rosenkrantz, his bodyguard. The guy who died with him." The idea sent a chill through Jacob. If the photo was real, it meant the treasure might not be a myth after all. Together, they decided to investigate. Their search took them deep into the Catskill Mountains. The woods were dense, ancient, the kind of place where silence had a weight of its own. They followed old logging roads and half-erased trails, relying on Mullen's memory and the cryptic clues in the photograph. Days passed. They found nothing but stones, leaves, and disappointment. On the fourth day, it rained endlessly, the ground turning to mud. Jacob wanted to give up, but Mullen insisted they keep moving. It was near dusk when they found it, a narrow waterfall hidden behind a curtain of vines. The kind of place you could walk past 100 times without noticing. The air was colder there, the spray sharp against their faces. Behind the waterfall, carved into the rock, they found something, a small cavity, sealed by earth and time. Inside, half buried in silt, was a rusted metal box. Jacob's hands shook as they pried it open. Inside were coins, corroded bills, and what looked like an old ledger, its pages fused by moisture but faintly legible. The first words on the cover read, "Accounts 1933. It wasn't millions, not even close, but it was proof that something had been hidden, something real. The discovery made headlines for a week before being dismissed by historians as another hoax or partial find. But Jacob knew better. The handwriting matched the old photos perfectly, and when he turned the last page of the ledger, he found a strange note scrawled in the margin. "The rest lies where the river bends twice. Don't trust the light. It could have been nonsense. Or it could have been the next clue." Jacob never found the second box, not for lack of trying. For months afterward, he returned to the woods, retracing his steps, driven by an obsession that mirrored the very madness Dutch Schultz had once lived by. Friends said he stopped sleeping, that he muttered to himself about the river and the light. Then, one day, he vanished. His car was found abandoned near the Ashokan Reservoir. Inside were his notes, his camera, and a single line written on a torn page. "He's still here." The police searched for weeks but found nothing. The story hit the tabloids. Filmmaker disappears chasing Dutch Schultz's treasure. Some said he fell into the river, others that he lost his mind and walked into the woods. But among the old-timers, the whispers returned. They said Schultz had claimed another soul. In the years that followed, Jacob's unfinished documentary became a cult legend. Film students analyzed the fragments he left behind, the interviews, the eerie voiceovers, the haunting images of empty forests and old breweries. One sequence in particular drew attention. A slow pan across a crumbling brick wall, where graffiti and faded paint spelled out, "He's watching." It was never clear who had written it, but the image became iconic, a symbol of obsession, greed, and the ghosts that haunt ambition. By the 2000s, the Schultz myth had outgrown its origins. It became a mirror for every generation's anxieties, the pursuit of wealth, the corruption of power, the price of defiance. Writers began comparing Dutch to tragic figures from literature, men who tried to shape their world and were crushed by it. Scholars saw in him a uniquely American story, the immigrant son who clawed his way to the top, only to be consumed by the same hunger that drove him. Yet, despite the analysis, the legend refused to die quietly. Treasure hunters still roamed the Catskills, now armed with metal detectors and GPS trackers. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to decoding Schultz's last words. In one episode, a linguist claimed that the dying gangster's ramblings were actually a coded message, each nonsensical phrase pointing to a real location. Others dismissed it as madness, the fragmented thoughts of a dying man. But those who believed continued searching, even now. People claim to hear strange things in those woods, the clink of metal, the faint smell of beer where no one has brooded in decades, a voice carried on the wind whispering in broken sentences. It's probably nothing more than imagination, but in the stillness of the forest, even myths feel real. Dutch Schultz may have died in 1935, but his story never stopped living. It grew roots deep and tangled, feeding on the fears and dreams of everyone who touched it. For some, it's a parable about greed. For others, it's a mystery begging to be solved. But for the city that birthed him, it remains something else. A reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, leaves behind a shadow. And in that shadow, the past is never truly gone. Because somewhere, out there in the dark, Dutch Schultz still waits, waiting for another dreamer, another believer, another fool willing to dig where the ground feels cursed, waiting for someone to carry his legend a little further into eternity. The city never forgets its ghosts. It just buries them beneath layers of noise and time. By the early 2010s, New York was unrecognizable from the one Dutch Schultz once ruled. The breweries had turned to condos, the speakeasies to boutique bars where craft cocktails replaced bootleg whiskey. The Bronx, his old kingdom, buzzed with new life, yet under the pavement, the earth still held the echoes of a man who had once built an empire on defiance. But as the world modernized, Dutch's legend refused to fade. It moved with the times, reshaping itself to fit every generation's hunger for mystery and rebellion. In 2012, a new wave of fascination ignited when an urban explorer stumbled upon an abandoned tunnel beneath a construction site near Hell Gate. The man posted grainy photos online, crumbling brickwork, old beer barrels, a faded wooden sign stamped with the initials WSB, the old logo of the William Schultz Brewery. The post went viral overnight. Conspiracy theorists, historians, and treasure hunters flooded forums, claiming this was proof that the lost fortune had been hidden beneath the city all along. Television crews arrived within days, digging for a story, and soon the ghost of Dutch Schultz was trending again. A group of amateur historians launched a crowdfunding campaign called Finding Dutch, promising to uncover the truth once and for all. They raised thousands of dollars in weeks and hired a small team to investigate. Their leader was a man named Leo Grant, a former archaeologist turned urban explorer who believed that Schultz's treasure wasn't in the Catskills at all. It was buried in New York. hidden in the tunnels that once carried beer and contraband across borough lines. He'd studied old bootlegging routes, maps of Prohibition-era supply chains, even letters from corrupt police officers. Every clue pointed, he said, to a network of forgotten tunnels that Schultz had used before his empire began to crumble. For months, Leo and his crew explored the underground maze. They found traces of old pipes, rusted hand trucks, fragments of glass bottles stamped with early 1930s markings. They filmed everything, each discovery, each dead end, each eerie silence echoing in the dark. The footage was mesmerizing. Viewers online followed the updates like an unfolding thriller, every episode ending with some new revelation. And then, one night, Leo posted something that changed everything. The video was simple, just Leo's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of a tunnel. His voice was hushed, trembling with excitement. "We found it," he whispered. The camera panned to a small alcove in the wall, sealed by a concrete slab. Etched into the stone were the faint, uneven letters, DS. Below them, a rusted lock. The screen went black. That was the last post from the Finding Dutch team. They disappeared from social media, their website taken offline without explanation. For weeks, speculation ran rampant. Some said they'd found the treasure and gone into hiding. Others said the city had shut them down, fearing the tunnels were unsafe. A few whispered that they'd awoken something better left buried. A year later, a worker doing maintenance in the same area found a single object half buried in the dirt, a camera cracked and covered in dust. Most of the footage was ruined, but one fragment survived. In it, Leo's voice echoed faintly, frantic and frightened. "It's not money," he said. "It's something else, something he left behind." Then the recording cut out. The story became a sensation. Documentaries were made, podcasts dissected every word, and Dutch Schultz's legend surged to life again. Reporters interviewed historians, mob experts, even psychics. Everyone wanted to know what Leo had meant. What had Dutch Schultz left behind, if not his money? Some believed he had hidden records, ledgers detailing payments to politicians, cops, and judges during Prohibition. If such evidence ever surfaced, it could have rewritten the city's political history. Others thought it was a symbolic treasure, something Dutch left behind to mock the world that had destroyed him. There were even those who believed it was a shrine, built by the gangster himself in his final days, a place to hold his sins. For months, people searched the tunnels again, but nothing was ever found. The spot Leo filmed was sealed by the city soon after, declared unsafe for exploration. Officially, no evidence of Schultz's treasure was ever recovered. But the mystery had taken on a life of its own. Dutch had found a way to rise again, not through violence or power, but through the sheer weight of his legend. Meanwhile, the academic world began revisiting his story from a different angle. A professor of criminology at NYU, Dr. Evelyn Caro, published a paper titled Dutch Schultz and the American Myth of the Self-Made Monster. In it, she argued that Schultz represented a darker reflection of the American dream. He was not born evil, she wrote. He was born desperate, in a city that rewarded cunning over morality. Schultz did not defy the system, he became its truest product. The paper sparked debate across universities. Was Dutch a villain, or merely a man molded by an unforgiving world? Dr. Caro's research brought her into contact with others who'd studied Schultz's rise. Old FBI files, personal letters, interviews with families of his associates. One letter, written by an unknown informant in 1935, caught her attention. It mentioned a hidden archive, stored not for greed, but for protection. He said the day they turn on him, he'll make the whole city burn, the letter read. And when the time comes, his words will speak louder than his guns ever did. Caro became fascinated by that line. What words? What archive? Was it possible that Schultz, paranoid and desperate before his death, had created some kind of insurance? Documents, recordings, or even confessions meant to survive him? She reached out to museums, libraries, and collectors, searching for traces of such material. Nothing turned up. But months later, she received a package with no return address. Inside was an old reel of film and a note that simply read, "You were right to look." The film was silent, grainy, its edges cracked with age. It showed a man who resembled Schultz sitting in what looked like a basement office, surrounded by beer barrels and stacks of cash. He held a glass, raised it toward the camera, and smiled. Then he leaned forward and mouthed something, just 2 words. Almost invisible. But when Caro slowed the footage and read his lips, the words were clear. Still here. The discovery was never authenticated, but it didn't matter. The footage spread online, feeding the myth once again. People claimed it was genuine, that Schultz had filmed it as part of his hidden archive. Others dismissed it as a clever forgery, but the effect was the same. The legend deepened, rooted itself even further in the city's imagination. By then, Dutch Schultz had transcended history. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was an idea. The treasure hunts, the ghost stories, the academic debates. They were all part of a larger obsession with what he symbolized. Power, rebellion, the eternal hunger that drove men to destroy themselves for more. And in that obsession, something strange happened. Artists began painting him. Street murals appeared in the Bronx depicting Schultz in a halo of smoke and beer foam, staring out with hollow eyes. Musicians wrote songs about him, dark ballads about ambition and betrayal. He even appeared in video games as a mythic figure whose treasure triggered endless quests. In every version, he was something different. A hero, a villain, a warning. It was as if the city couldn't let him go. Maybe it never would. In one of the final interviews before her death, Dr. Caro said something that captured the essence of the man better than any biography ever could. Dutch Schultz wasn't the devil, she said softly. He was what happens when a man tries to outrun his own fear. He built an empire not to rule the world, but to silence the part of himself that still remembered being powerless. And that's why he'll never truly die, because that fear, that hunger still lives in all of us. Her words resonated deeply. They struck a chord not just with historians or gangster enthusiasts, but with ordinary people who saw in Schultz's story the reflection of something human, something tragic. Even today, when the night grows quiet and the lights of the city dim, there are those who claim to see him. A shadow in an alley, a flicker in an old mirror, a laugh that doesn't belong. Cab drivers have reported picking up a man in a vintage suit who gives them directions to streets that no longer exist. By the time they turn to look again, the back seat is empty, and the air smells faintly of beer. It could be nothing more than stories, illusions born of nostalgia and imagination. But in a city built on both, who's to say? Maybe Dutch never left. Maybe, as he said in that final delirious hour, he was still here. Because Dutch Schultz didn't just build an empire in his time. He built a legend that refused to stay buried. The man may have died in 1935, but his ghost still walks among the skyscrapers and subways, watching, waiting, reminding the living that some dreams can't be killed, and some ambitions are too fierce to fade. The beer baron of New York, the mad king of the Bronx, the ghost of Prohibition, whatever name history gives him. One truth remains: he got what he always wanted. Immortality, paid for in blood, whiskey, and whispers. The night was heavy with rain when the last echoes of Dutch Schultz's name finally slipped into legend. The city was half asleep, and somewhere in the depths of a forgotten basement beneath the Bronx, the water dripped steadily from rusted pipes, landing on an old wooden crate that no one had touched in nearly a century. On the side, faded by time and dust, was a name: Schultz Import Co. No one alive knew what was inside anymore, and no one dared to find out. For the living, the name Dutch Schultz was a myth, a story told in hushed tones over whiskey glasses and neon lights. But for the dead, for the city itself, it was something else entirely. It was unfinished business. Generations had passed since the gangster's reign, yet his story lingered in strange places. A bar owner in Harlem claimed that once a year, around October, his lights flickered for no reason, and the smell of stale beer filled the air. An old caretaker at a cemetery swore he'd seen a man in a gray suit standing over an unmarked grave long after midnight, muttering words he couldn't quite make out. Every neighborhood that Schultz had ever touched seemed to hold on to a piece of him, like the city itself refused to let him rest. But perhaps the strangest part of all was that Dutch's empire, for all its violence and chaos, had reshaped New York forever. When the government ended Prohibition, the underground bars didn't vanish, they evolved. The mob's money found its way into construction, unions, even politics. The beer that once flowed through secret tunnels was now bottled and taxed. But the greed, the ambition, the hunger, it was the same. Schultz had been right about one thing. Once you get a taste of power, it's never enough. The names changed, The faces changed, but the game remained the same, and in that way, Dutch won. His ghost lingered not as a figure haunting alleyways, but as a warning that echoed through every backroom deal and every handshake sealed in silence. When you build your empire on sin, the foundation will always crack. But in those cracks, the next generation always finds room to plant their seeds. One winter evening in 2023, an aging journalist named Walter Grady sat in his Manhattan apartment surrounded by stacks of papers, photographs, and yellowed FBI files. He had spent the last 20 years piecing together the tangled history of Prohibition's forgotten kingpins. Luciano, Lansky, Capone, all had been written and rewritten. But Schultz was different. The contradictions fascinated him. He was ruthless yet loyal, brutal yet oddly principled. He had dreamed like a poet and killed like a soldier. Walter believed that Dutch Schultz's story was more than a gangster tale. It was a mirror of the American soul. What kept him awake at night wasn't the violence or the money, it was the mystery. The missing millions, the buried vault, the cryptic words Schultz had muttered on his deathbed. Walter had read every version, studied every autopsy report, every newspaper clipping. He knew that Dutch had been shot at the Palace Chop House, that he'd lain bleeding for hours, rambling nonsense to detectives who wrote down every word. But to Walter it didn't sound like nonsense at all. It sounded like code. One phrase haunted him more than the rest. "Mother, look at the angels. I'll be in the front seat." People dismissed it as delirium, but Walter thought differently. Dutch had always spoken in riddles when he didn't trust those around him. What if his dying words weren't madness but directions? And so, late one night, he decided to follow the trail one last time. He began with an old map of Newark, tracing the path from the Palace Chop House to the old brewery district. He compared it to Prohibition-era supply routes and then to modern subway blueprints. One location kept reappearing, a patch of industrial land near the Passaic River that had been privately owned since 1936, its records sealed. When Walter finally tracked down the current owner, he was stunned. The property was registered to a shell company called Angelic Holdings, LLC. His pulse quickened. Angels. The next morning, Walter drove out to the site. The place was nothing more than a fenced-off warehouse, silent and crumbling, with graffiti on its walls and weeds bursting through the asphalt. The gate was locked, but Walter was old enough to know that locks were just suggestions. He squeezed through a gap in the fence, flashlight in hand, and entered the building. Inside, the air was damp and thick with the smell of mold. His footsteps echoed. Dust motes drifted through the beam of his light. He walked past broken furniture, rusted beer vats, and piles of rotting wood. In the back corner, half buried beneath debris, he found what he hadn't expected: a staircase leading down. The concrete steps were cracked, but solid enough. At the bottom, the air grew colder. He shone the light around, revealing a narrow tunnel reinforced with old timber beams. His heart raced. Every instinct told him he'd found something. He followed the tunnel for what felt like hours until he reached a small chamber carved into the earth. And there, in the center, stood a wooden crate identical to the one the caretaker had described decades ago. Walter's hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside were stacks of papers, ledgers, and photographs wrapped in oilcloth. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Dutch Schultz's. Walter leafed through them carefully. They weren't records of money or smuggling routes. They were something else. Letters, confessions, each one addressed to a different person. A priest, a judge, a woman named Emma he'd once loved. They were written in a tone unlike anything Walter had ever read from Schultz. They were raw, human, desperate. In one, he wrote, "I thought power would silence the noise inside me. But the louder I got, the more the noise screamed, maybe hell isn't a place you go. It's what follows you when you never stop running." Walter read for hours, his eyes blurring with tears. For the first time, he felt he understood the man behind the myth. Schultz hadn't just built an empire to dominate others. He'd built it to escape himself. But there was one final envelope at the bottom of the crate, sealed in wax and marked with a simple phrase, "For the one who listens." Walter opened it. Inside was a single page containing an address in the Bronx and a date, October 23rd, the anniversary of Schultz's death. Beneath it, a message. "If you still hear me, come." The next night, driven by curiosity or fate, or maybe madness, Walter went to the address. It led him to an old bar that had long since closed, its sign barely hanging above the door. He entered through the back, and there, in the dim light of a single bulb, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the wall, scrawled in chalk, were two words, "Still here." A chill passed through the room. The bulb flickered once and went out. Walter stood in silence, his heart pounding, the air thick with the scent of beer and something else, something old. He whispered into the darkness, "Dutch?" No answer came, but somewhere in the shadows he thought he heard a faint laugh. Not cruel, not mocking, just tired. A man's laugh echoing through time. When the lights flickered back to life, the words on the wall were gone. Walter left the bar shaken but strangely calm. He returned home and spent the following week compiling everything he'd found into a manuscript. He titled it The Last Confession of Dutch Schultz. It was never published. The files were found years later, stacked neatly beside his typewriter, as if he had finished writing and simply stopped. The manuscript contained one final note written in Walter's handwriting. He was right. He never left. Because he's not a ghost, he's a reminder. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe Dutch Schultz wasn't haunting New York because of greed or vengeance. Maybe he stayed because his story was never about treasure or murder. It was about the cost of chasing power at all costs. The city he'd once ruled still bore his fingerprints, hidden in the way its people hustled, schemed, and dreamed. He had become part of its pulse, its rhythm, its hunger, so the legend lived on. Tourists still whispered about his buried fortune. Filmmakers still resurrected his name, and on cold October nights, bartenders still raised a glass to the beer baron of New York. But those who truly knew his story, the ones who'd read his letters, who'd walked through his shadows, understood something deeper. They knew that Dutch Schultz wasn't just a gangster story. He was a man who tried to become more than the world would allow, and in doing so, became less than human. His rise and fall were not a cautionary tale. They were prophecy. For as long as there are men who dream of owning the world, there will be another Dutch Schultz waiting to be born. Another empire built in the dark. Another ghost walking the streets of New York, chasing echoes of greatness and finding only the hollow silence of ambition. And maybe one day someone will find that final crate. Maybe they'll read his words, hold the paper he once touched, and understand. Not just the man, but the truth he carried. The one truth that every gangster learns too late. You can conquer the city, but you can never escape yourself. The rain fell harder that night, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the skyline. Somewhere a bar light flickered. Somewhere, a story began again, and in the eternal hum of New York, if you listen closely, you might still hear a whisper beneath the noise. Soft, defiant, unbroken, still here.